Okay, here's my follow-up for week 6. So according to week 6, they highlighted and previewed ahead of time pages 27 through 34, which is what we are going to discuss in week 6. So the basic concepts that are being covered in this section is the predicate noun. Linking verbs are introduced here. Then they introduce the idea of quod, which really gets us into subordinate clauses. So we're going to have main clauses and subordinate clauses. So what I did was, at the beginning of class, in order for us to get into our conversation on predicate nouns, I came here to exercise 25, where we have a whole bunch of sentences in English. And if we look through all of these sentences, we'll see the pattern repeat itself. This idea of subject, linking verb, predicate nominative. Now, I will say sometimes it's just an intransitive verb. It doesn't have a predicate nominative. So that is definitely something you want to make sure we understand the difference between. So anyway, I put these sentences up on the board. I had them pre-ready before class started. They were not labeled or anything. They just were there. And as a class, I, again, asked them to make observations. What do you notice? Some of the things that they said was that this is kind of a hard thing sometimes, because they'll look at content. They'll be like, well, there's Christians and there's Christ everywhere. And I'm like, well, let's talk about the structure of the sentence. What do you notice? So I think at some point somebody noticed there were several of phrases: of God, of Christ, of the servants, of Christ. And so then I said, well, which of these sentences are similar and which ones are different in that case? Well, we had several ofs and we had 2 ins. So prepositional phrases. So we marked those up. We put parentheses around them and marked them up. And then, again, they were kind of struggling a little bit with where I wanted them to go. And so I said, well, look at the verb. What do you notice about the verb? And then somebody said, oh, they're all, actually, I think they said they were helping verbs. And then somebody corrected it and said, no, they're linking verbs. So we refreshed our memory on linking verbs. And actually, I don't think I have it. Oh, I do. Here it is. I think I pulled out my, oh geez, this thing is hard to find what you want. This page right here. And we reviewed to be, am, are, is, was, were, be, being, been, those. And so we talked about, the state of being and linking verbs and so forth. Anyway, so we looked at our sentences. We continued labeling using this idea of question confirmation. So we would say the subject verb what, and if that answer to that question would replace the subject or describe the subject, in this situation, all of them replace, so we would label them as predicate nominative. So Son is referring to Christ, so we're going to label it predicate nominative. So that's why I think I had this Christ equals Son here. So we went through each of them, labeling through predicate nominative. Then we got down here, we realized there wasn't one, because somebody was tried to tell me that towns was the predicate nominative. The servants are, and I'm like, well, are the towns referring to the servants? Like, are they the same thing? And they're like, well, no. I'm like, well, what makes this one different? And they're, oh yeah, this one's a preposition. This has in. And anyway, so we labeled this as an intransitive verb as opposed to a linking verb. So then we spent some time with our definitions and we reviewed our memory work from foundations. We did all of this out loud. I did not write it on the board, but linking verbs, intransitive verbs, and what is a predicate nominative. We actually did diagram one of these sentences in English. I did not write it on my board notes, but it is on the photograph that I took of my actual board. So anyway, that got us through the grammar of what these patterns that we are going to be going through are. So that meant we needed to get into understanding these Latin linking verbs. So I put these verbs that I have in yellow here up on the board, and I asked them what they saw. What looks familiar? And it was quiet. And I was like, well, can you think of a song? Does anybody remember a song? see anything in here that takes you back to those songs you sing in foundations? And somebody said, well, OST must isn't. And then I'm like, yeah, but what's different? We recognize that this one is an M and not an O. So I said, guess what? We just learned something new. Sometimes it's O, sometimes it's M. We'll learn more about that later. So this took us into a conversation about personal pronouns and first person singular, second person singular, third person singular. Now, believe it or not, just because they memorize it in foundations and they can chant it or sing a song doesn't necessarily mean they understand the content. So we needed to take some time and make sure, what does first person really mean? Well, first person is when the speaker is talking about himself. You know, I did it and I did that, I saw this, I'm talking about myself. In the plural, then I walked over next to a student and I was like, and I, put my arm around him. It was actually my son. I put my arm around him like, we study Latin. So I'm still talking about myself, but I'm also including another person, so now it's plural. So we made sure we understood what first person means. It involves the speaker. And then we talked about second person. And so we used several examples where you're talking to a person. And then we went to third person. That means you're talking about someone. So I would look at one student and point to another kid across the room, and I'd be like, here, let me tell you about him. Or he has a purple shirt on, or whatever it may be. Anyway, so make sure they understand what pronouns am I referring to when I say first person plural. So you'd be surprised, you think they know these things, but they don't. So those things need to be reviewed and gone over. So then we just used our native English speaking skills and we stuck the correct verb onto that. And so that took us to the chart that is on page 28. Okay, this is something that you are going to be copying over and over and over again in the workbook, and it is right there. It's page 127, and it's that top section, the present tense. That's where we are right now. So they need to know what those words mean. And I think when I put it on their homework assignment, they're copying it like 3 times every time they copy it. Anyway, so that got us into introduction of the verbs. And so we were then able to come to this sentence. I kind of have it crammed in here. And we walked through the process of translating this sentence. Step 1 is always find your verb. And somebody made the observation that it's not at the end of the sentence anymore. And that takes us to the rule here. See that? It can stand anywhere in the sentence or that particular clause. So then we found all of our nouns, we found the endings, we determined the declension and gender. We noticed that now we have 2 nominatives. So I'm like, I wonder why that is. Because we don't have 2 subjects. There's only one of them doing something, and so that took us really back to that concept of the predicate nominative is replacing the subject. So it would make sense for it to also be in the nominative case. So both of these are in the nominative case. So I asked them, how do you know which one is the subject and which one is the predicate nominative? So in this sentence, you can tell we already have the translation here. Is it Christ is the Son of God, or is the Son of God is Christ? So honestly, you could say it either way. You just need to make sure you get your of God along with this one right here. So I guess just it's really about recognizing patterns. Typically in the Latin sentences, if it's the subject, it's going to come first in the sentence. The predicate nominative will come later. So I guess that's it. So hopefully that makes sense. At some point we did come back through after we had kind of done all of this preview work of recognizing patterns. I had a student read out loud. We discussed this right here, and I had them try to explain to me, what does this mean? Do we understand the patterns? Do we understand the rules? Can y'all explain it to me? Again, I want them to learn to read text and comprehend it and be able to teach themselves over time. Hopefully that's the eventual goal. So again, we read through that. We looked at that rule. And then we turn the page and we have our new concept here, which is this idea of quod and because. And so I think we made some observations about the sentence here. We read this And I'm like, do you guys remember what a subordinate clause is? We talked a little bit about what we learned in Essentials. And actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Before we even got there, I asked them, I was like, what do you have to have in order to have a sentence? And they said a subject and a verb. So I made up this sentence. We have a student in our class that really enjoys baking. So I made up this sentence, Sophia bakes. Like, it's not a super exciting sentence. It's pretty plain, but it is a sentence. It is a complete thought. I'm like, what could I do to make it not a complete sentence? I said, what if I add this conjunction to it? Because Sophia bakes. All of a sudden, you're waiting for more information. It sounds like I have forgotten the rest of my sentence. So adding this conjunction will turn an independent clause into a dependent clause. That's an important concept. So that's when we came over here and we read this. And I had them underline the main clause once and the subordinate clause twice in their textbooks. So we walked back over here and I made up the sentence. I visit the Maxwells because Sophia bakes. We identified our main clause will have a subject and a verb. This one also has a direct object. This will stand alone. I visit the Maxwells. Sounds like a complete thought. This does not stand alone. It's a subordinate clause. By definition, we review also that clause means it has a subject and a verb. So by definition, a subordinate clause will have a subject and verb in it, but it will not stand alone. If I take away the conjunction, it does turn into a complete thought. Then we talked about if we were writing this in the Latin, because we now have two clauses, your verb will come at the end, not of the sentence, but at the end of the clause. So I don't have the Latin for this particular sentence, so I just pretended. If this was in the Latin, it would go in this order. I, Maxwell's, visit, because your quod will come between, and then the subject and the verb. We always end with our verb in the Latin. So anyway, that got us through the assignment, and we ran out of time. I did have this sentence that I was going to have us work on together, but we ran out of time, and I guess that's it. So one other thing I want to point out, I do have this chart. I think I had posted this at one point, but this will give you kind of the grammar that's being taught, and you really want to use this Latin time to teach your kids grammar. Over here, I think we have the use of the predicate noun. Look at all of the things that we can learn in these 2 pages. There is a lot of grammar here. We've got predicate nouns, linking verbs. We can review the personal pronouns, the number, subordinate conjunctions, conjunctive adverbs like transitions, because I believe we have a therefore in our vocabulary. Main clauses versus subordinate clause, present versus past tense verb, because all of our, now we didn't talk about it in class today, but all of our verbs here are in the present tense. So later on, when we learn more about this verb, when we change and have to do past tense or future tense, our endings are going to change. So anyway, you can review different tenses at home with your kids. So there's a lot of grammar to go over here with this particular lesson. So anyway, I hope this is helpful.